What is love?
Baby, don't hurt me no more.
As always, we can count on the ancient Greeks to get real autistic about this subject, having 6 distinct words for the concept, though largely inventions by philosophers rather than words in common parlance. Side note, you may have heard of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which posits that the language you speak determines how you think. This was the whole plot of Arrival, but in reality it's the reverse that is true. What a language does or does not have words for can tell you a lot about the culture it comes from. Inuit languages often get called out on this for having lots of different words for snow, but they kind of need those distinctions. They are surrounded by the stuff for most of the year. Language is as specific as it needs to be. To a normal person, if you show them this and ask them what it is, they'll probably say, a fish? But if you asked an ichthyologist, they'd say, ah yes, Rastrelliger canagurta, the Indian mackerel, clearly showcasing its characteristic longitudinal bands. All of this to say, ancient Greek philosophers had nothing better to do with their time than categorize abstract concepts, so why not try to sort the idea of love into discrete boxes? Going in English alphabetical order, we have agape, often translated as affection, which means love in the sense that Christians consider Jesus to be the God of love, love for your fellow human beings.
Harmony and understanding.
What I personally would call empathy. Then we have eros, which is Greek for getting busy. Bow, chicka, bow, ow. That is where we get the word erotic. Plato believed that eros transcended bodily desire and happened between souls, soul-to-soul communication, if you will. Hence our modern phrase, platonic love, but the more typical definition of eros corresponds to lust, or at least romantic passion. Next up is philia, corresponding more or less to friendship, often translated as brotherly love, which is where the city of Philadelphia gets its name. This is what most modern people think of when they use the term platonic love, which is amusing. Then there's storge, which describes familial love, specifically between parents and children, though it can also represent love for a leader or one's own country, so patriotism or nationalistic pride, or love for a sports team could all be considered a form of storge. Philotia is the word for self-love, which in moderation manifests as self-confidence and self-worth, and when overdone can lead to narcissism. Finally, there's xenia, or hospitality, which describes the rituals of hosting or meeting strangers. Handshakes, I brought a bottle of Chardonnay, may I take your coats, sort of thing. This is what Walder Frey violated when he did the Red Wedding.
The Lannisters send their regards.
I'm not sure I'd really categorize this myself as a form of love per se, but the Greeks did, so what are you gonna do? Modern scientists have refined this categorization somewhat. Helen Fisher, an anthropologist, worked with a team to conduct the first MRI scans of people reportedly in love to see what was going on in their brains. She noted 3 stages of love: lust, attraction, and attachment. Each is biologically distinct, using different hormones in different regions of the brain. Lust works primarily off of testosterone and estrogen, while attraction produces dopamine when you see or think of the object of your attraction. Given that much of her research was done in the 90s, it focused on cisgender straight people, and found that straight men associate attraction with visual stimuli. Do she got big honkers to make milk for my spawn? While straight women linked more to memory, remembering whether or not the grunting Neanderthal pursuing her exhibited behaviors suggestive of being a good husband and father. Later scientists have built on this work, looking not just at brain scans but also hormone levels, identifying several different neurotransmitters associated with sexual desire, courtship and bonding attraction, obsessive thinking, and attachment. And while the initial research focused on sexual and romantic love, similar principles seem to apply to friendship and familial bonds as well. So then that's the answer. Love is hormones. Well, yes and no. That's like saying,
Gravity is what causes you to fall.
when someone asks what gravity is, what they're really asking for is a whole bunch of math to describe how it does that. And to me, while acknowledging that love, whether romantic or otherwise, is caused by tiny chemicals rushing through my brain, that doesn't really give me a working model of what exactly I should do about it. I'm all for the science answer in most cases, but here saying it's hormones, while fascinating from an analytical point of view, is far less interesting than asking and answering questions like, what does love make us do? How does love manifest in behavior? Or, why does watching the two cartoon canids of separate species fighting make me cry? To answer that one, we first need to detour to author Daniel P. Mannix, who led kind of a wild life. He worked in a circus, trained animals, including a pet cheetah, and wrote several books, including the one Gladiator is based off of. This guy wrote both a landmark treatise on the Atlantic slave trade, and also a whole bunch of literary analysis of the Wizard of Oz books. Of interest to us today is The Fox and the Hound, which was published in 1967, after winning a competition held by the publication company looking for animal stories from new authors. Mannix was kind of a stretch for that latter part by this point, having published his first book in 1951, but whatever. Now, while in the Robin Hood video I talked at length about fiction featuring anthropomorphized animals, Mannix very deliberately set out to write a book that kept the animals animalistic, writing in his author's note, "Any author who writes a book with an animal hero automatically lays himself open to the charge of anthropomorphism, often with justification. We can guess at what goes on in an animal's mind only by comparing his mental processes with ours. This is a poor system, as an animal's way of thinking is so different from ours that he may perform an act which seems to us the result of reason from some quite different motive. I believe that animals can reason, but on a very rudimentary level compared to a human." Throughout The Fox and the Hound, which is written entirely from an animal perspective, alternating between the two titular beasts, Mannix takes great pains to make sure we are not humanizing the protagonists. The animals do not have an internal monologue, they do not speak or use words, and the narrator constantly reminds us that the animal's behavior is mostly a result of instinctive responses to stimuli. Todd the fox is able to figure out how traps work because they smell wrong, noting that the earth around them is disturbed, and observing what happens when they are triggered. He never makes logical leaps, he never has any eureka moments, and cannot use his knowledge to make decisions that a human being would. If a strategy works for him, he doesn't deviate from it until it stops working, and only then does he change his behavior. The dog Copper, meanwhile, experiences the world mostly in smells, and while he recognizes different humans by their smells and by what happens when they appear, he doesn't know what they're saying beyond his own name, and doesn't understand when he gets pulled off of a scent trail by his master to go somewhere else. While anthropomorphization is often used as a tool to get the audience to empathize with an animal character, relating them to our own human life, Mannix very effectively encourages the reader to empathize with Todd and Copper by bringing us into their animal world, rather than dragging them into ours. Forced out of his usual range, the fox was running blindly through a new housing development. There were innumerable cars, children playing on the lawns, and many houses, but Copper hardly noticed them, so intent was he on the slight form that drifted just ahead. In full cry, the pack hurled themselves forward, their voices bounding off the close-packed houses. People were running out of the doors, children were screaming with fright, and dozens of cur dogs had suddenly appeared and were barking hysterically at the oncoming hounds. No one seemed to notice the shadowy form of the silent fox as he glided through hedges, around trees, and ducked past swings and sandboxes. As the hunt tore through the development, screaming women clutched their children, and men dashed out shouting at the riders and kicking at the hounds who were trying to get past them. Utterly bewildered, Copper swerved aside, made a detour, and tried to come up with the fox again. But now there were people everywhere, and judging from the sound, the pack had gotten into a fight with the cur dogs. A car with a siren and flashing light on top came roaring down the street, and Copper decided to get out of there fast. What I find most interesting about all of this is that while in something like Watership Down, where the rabbits have essentially a conlang to try to demonstrate their lack of understanding, like how there are evil creatures screaming along the Black River in The Fox and the Hound, they just use normal English vocabulary. There are cars on the road. Todd and Copper know what cars are, they know what roads are, they know what trees and squirrels and apples are. They don't need fancy neologisms to show confusion. Rather than using metaphor and letting the reader try to puzzle out what's being talked about, the narrator is always very clear about what exactly is happening, even often giving the reader information that the animals are missing. As he grew bigger, the man did a number of curious acts that puzzled and somewhat annoyed Todd. He would throw some object on the floor, and the dog would bring it to him. Then he would throw it out for Todd. Todd understood what the man wanted him to do and would pick up the object, but as there was no reason he could see to bring it to the man, he would carry it off. The man would catch him, put the object in his mouth, and close his jaws over it. Todd hated this performance and fought it so furiously that the man gave up. Todd was willing enough to play, but he saw no reason why he should do something he did not want to do, and as he had no desire to please the man as did the dog, he would never retrieve. And yes, Todd is raised by humans, rather briefly, as he quite quickly escapes the farmhouse he's raised in and takes to the wild. One thing that the reader is left to wonder is whether Todd's experience with humans is what allows him to evade capture for so long, and the book never explicitly confirms this. Mannix was far less interested in teasing world building and much more interested in making the reader think about the intended themes, without spoon-feeding a conclusion, as every good author should aspire to do. Frantic with pride and delight, he groveled on the ground, turning his head sideways to expose the jugular vein as a sign of utter abjection, to ingratiate himself further with his master, whom he recognized as a stronger animal. And what are the themes of this story? There are several. First is nature versus nurture. Is Todd so clever because he was raised by humans, or is that a disadvantage for him? Such as when an older vixen he mates with has to save him and show him how to hunt. And when comparing Todd and Copper, where the hound spends his days chained to a barrel, and the fox spends his free in the wilderness, is that why one is so obedient and the other so eager to escape? Or is it the biological realities of their different species? The master rose and limped toward them. Copper rose to greet him, proudly wagging his tail in conscious self-esteem for having done a good job of trailing. The master paid no attention to him. He went over to Chief, and, taking the Trig's head between his hands, spoke to him in the love talk that once he had used only to Copper. Watching them with savage jealousy, Copper knew that his day was done, and that soon there would be a new leader of the pack. But perhaps more important thematically is the struggle between man and nature. The first half of the book marks Todd's narrow escapes from various hunters, humans who infringe on the fox's natural territory, seeking to kill him not to eat or because he's a threat to them, but for sport, because they thrill at firing their gun and seeing an animal die. Now, to be fair, Todd is shown doing pretty much exactly the same thing, killing other animals when he isn't hungry purely for the pleasure of it. And as a predator, he has to kill other creatures in order to live. Yet he is still an animal himself, and Mannix makes it very clear that he is not making rational choices like a human. Meanwhile, the human hunters have chosen quite deliberately to go out of their way to kill a fox. And for what? There's no good eating on a fox. It's small and gamey. If you were all that concerned about a fox getting into your chicken coop, you put up a better fence. Oh, you want the fur? How about you take a good look at the sheep, which gives you buckets of wool for free. All you gotta do is feed it. It just stands there. No, you deliberately chose to, with your leisure time, tramp on into nature and go kill something that never bothered you. In the second chapter, Copper's master takes him and his other hounds into the woods on a hunt, and for page after page we're told about Copper's diligent tracking, pursuing the fox farther and farther, barking and baying to note when he's close, pushing the animal to keep running. As a last desperate attempt to get the dogs off his trail, to live, Todd leads Chief onto the train tracks. When the master finds Chief's dead body, he is beside himself with grief and rage, and unleashes a vendetta against Todd that lasts the rest of the book, killing both of his wives and all of his children. And you know what? I have no sympathy. You took it upon yourself to bother this wild animal, to press it from its home, force it to flee for its life, and you have the gall to be sad when that ends up killing one of your dogs. Todd was acting in self-defense. You, the hunter, killed your dog. The second half of the book brings us man in the form of urban encroachment. Suburbs are built around Todd's forest, and piece by piece the wilderness and rural farms are turned into houses and highways and strip malls. Smog fills the air and chemicals leach into the water supply. But initially the fox population booms as they become scavengers, feasting on the smorgasbord of food, of humans, pets, and trash. Until one of them gets rabies, and now the suburbanites will no longer tolerate the wild animals whose homes they stole, and the hunter is hired to kill the last foxes. Several times the fox had tried to double back toward his old range, but each time something had frustrated him. Copper came to one place where he had tried 4 times to cross a highway, each time to be turned back by the traffic. Another time he had found himself in a new development and been chased by dogs. The shock had killed his scent, and it was more by sheer good luck than skill that Copper had been able to pick up the trail again. The quarry had tried to cross a bridge over a river, only to find people parked there in cars. At last the fox had given up trying to return to his home range and cut straight across country. Todd finally loses, not because he got too old, or because his cleverness finally failed him, or because he made some mistake. He loses because there's no longer anywhere he can run or hide. Man has claimed everything. And so Copper is finally able to run him down and exhaust him. And when the hound finally reaches Todd, the fox is dead. Of course, neither the dog nor the hunter get a happy ending, for with all the foxes dead, the hunter's services are no longer needed, and his ramshackle cabin is now an unsightly blight for the homeowners association, and he is evicted. The book ends with him taking Copper out for a final walk with his shotgun. Yes, while this book may have very deservedly been a Reader's Digest Book Club selection for 1967, it is very much not a book for children. There is explicit sex between foxes. Animals often subdue each other by biting down on genitals and routinely mark their territory with urine and feces. It is also a very violent and a very bleak book, unflinchingly depicting death and the impact of humans on their environment. And I gotta say, out of all the books I've read for this series, I think it's my favorite. It's certainly the first one that actually feels like it was written for an adult audience, with a couple words that even I had to look up. Word of the day, sedulous, and is haunting, visceral, and thematically rich. So of course, the most natural studio to adapt this bleak meditation on man's impact on nature was Disney! Before The Fox and the Hound won that fancy Animal Book Award, and thus before it was even officially published, Disney slurped up the film rights. 10 years later, Woolly Ratherman decided to actually do something about those film rights, and in 1977, a couple months before The Rescuers entered theaters, production began on Disney's The Fox and the Hound. Now, we may have entered the Dark Age, and the finished product, as we will soon see, is plenty dark, but there are certain things that Disney were never going to do, and changes were made to make sure parents wouldn't freak out about taking their kids to see this movie. And that's not a bad thing. As I have said several times now, I am less interested in a faithful adaptation than I am in a good piece of media. So Disney did exactly what Daniel Mannix explicitly tried to avoid, and they anthropomorphized all the animals. Because of this, the themes of the story kind of had to change. The film isn't really about nature versus nurture or man versus the environment, though there are still echoes of those themes present. Instead, Disney chose to make essentially a Romeo and Juliet story with a slightly less tragic ending. That is, they made the Fox and the Hound friends. Now, there are some who claim that this idea came from a different book, The Ballad of the Bellstone Fox, which was published in 1970. That novel has a somewhat similar plot. Tag the fox is raised by humans, but eventually goes back to the wild where he's hunted down by a hound. The difference is that Merlin the hound is the same age as him, and they grow up together, and in the final hunt they end up reconciling after the hunter dies of a heart attack. This idea is so pervasive that the 40th anniversary release of the film version of the Bellstone Fox claims to have been the inspiration for Disney's movie. However, despite their similarities, there are two raging differences between the two books. Firstly, where Mannix's work centers entirely on the two animals with not a single piece of dialogue in the entire text, David Rook's ballad very heavily focuses on the human characters, with significant stretches of it devoted to interpersonal drama that has nothing to do with the titular animal. The second difference is that The Fox and the Hound is actually good. The Ballad of the Bellstone Fox is kind of laughably bad, with cringeworthy dialogue and horrid pacing. It is very British, and I mean that in the most derogatory way. Mannix, for instance, managed to go the entirety of his book without once using a racial slur, a feat that Rook cannot claim to have matched. For comparison, I'll read how each of the books handles their scene where the fox leads a dog in front of a train. Yes, they both do that. We'll start with Mannix. The pulsation of the rail increased. The train was bearing down on them. Todd could see that the hound was right behind him. He waited as long as he dared, and then flung himself off the rail and down the embankment. As he did so, he heard the desperate call of the horn, the frenzied whistle of the train, and then a single scream of agony from the hound. The train swept past, while the panting fox made his way to the juniper tangle and dropped dead beat. I think that spoke pretty well for itself. The short sentences give the passage a rhythm and urgency, and we infer what happened through context, through what Todd hears as he flees the scene. And here's how the ballad handles it. Tag looked up and saw the dark mass looming up and thundering at him. Obeying blind instinct, he flung himself to one side, using the last dregs of his strength, and rolled helplessly down the bank as the train roared past and plowed through the leading hounds at 70 miles an hour, scattering them like confetti and leaving them broken and bleeding in its wake. What a stirring passage, David. One singular run-on sentence that I was unable to manage in a single breath despite my best effort, and just such an evocative and appropriate word choice for your description of the gory deaths of a dozen animals. No notes. Were the Disney crew inspired by the later book to make the changes they did? It's certainly possible, but I think it's equally likely that they hadn't even read the ballad and came to similar conclusions on what adaptational changes to make on their own. Certainly no one involved with the making of this film has ever mentioned Rook's novel, which I personally would regard as an inferior ripoff of Mannix's classic. Disney also made other adaptational changes. They swapped the ages of Copper and Chief so that Copper could grow up in tandem with Todd, though Chief does still take a train to the Kisser, which we'll talk about in a little bit. To give more time for Todd and Copper to form their friendship, most of the hunting, which makes up the vast majority of the book, is relegated to the back half of the film. Also, a fight with a big old bear is swapped from the beginning to the end, which we will also discuss later. There are also several added characters. Todd's caretaker, Widow Tweed, is fleshed out far more than her book counterpart, and a trio of birds, Big Mama, Dinky, and Boomer, help Todd navigate his adolescence and adulthood, and are honestly quite toyetic. Disney gonna Disney, and boy howdy do they want to sell merchandise. As I've mentioned in the previous couple videos, this is the time where the 9 old men began to retire. Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnston, and Woolie Reitherman were the only ones left at this point, and Frank and Ollie only did some initial animation work before leaving the project and the company, leaving Woolie as the sole holdout and co-director with Art Stevens, who had stepped in to help direct The Rescuers after the death of John Lounsbury. Now, one figure I have not yet mentioned is Ron Miller, who was Walt's son-in-law and had been groomed by the old man to be a producer, and after helming a string of live-action films, began to take a leadership role in animation, starting with The Rescuers. While throughout the 60s and into the 70s, Woolie had enjoyed a lot of creative freedom and took up the mantle of creative lead in the animation department after Walt's death, he was never given any sort of formal title. That left the actual executives at the company actually in charge, but both Don Tatum and Card Walker gave Woolie the freedom to do whatever he wanted, as long as the films continued to make money, which they did. Ron Miller was different. While he wouldn't become president of the company until 1980 and CEO until 1983, he nonetheless became very involved with the animation department as executive producer. So when the new generation of animators began to chafe at some of the decisions Reitherman was making, it was Miller who had to step in and mediate the disputes. However, Woolie had presumably gotten fairly used to the wide latitude Tatum and Walker had given him and turned out to be pretty stubborn and unwilling to share power. All of this would come to a head in 1979. It's a little hard to piece together an actual timeline of events, but it seems that Woolie at one point in production wanted to bring in Phil Harris and Charo as singing cranes, but all the younger animators, including Art Stevens, thought this was a stupid idea, and eventually Woolie was talked out of it. What is unclear to me is whether this happened before or after Don Bluth decided to resign. It was a decision he had likely been chewing on for a while, but on his birthday no less, he left the company, specifically citing Reitherman's poor leadership, taking with him 15 other animators who would go on to found their own animation studio.
With blackjack and hookers!
Again, I haven't been able to piece together an exact timeline, but I'd like to think the straw that broke Bluth's back was the prospect of having to animate Charo as a dancing crane in a pink leotard. Hey, this is Future Weiro in the editing bay, remembering as I am putting this together that Bluth actually did exactly that for Thumbelina, so maybe that wasn't the reason. This was a devastating blow to the company. Bluth had been a rising star, being a directing animator on The Rescuers as well as on The Fox and the Hound before he resigned and asked that he be struck from that film's credits. This meant that the film had to be completed by even less experienced animators, so Miller pushed back the release date by 6 months. Reitherman didn't think the new animators were up to the task, and so he stepped down as director and is credited only as a co-producer with Art Stevens in the final product. However, as we'll see, new animators such as Glenn Keane, Ron Clements, John Musker, and Chris Buck, who will be very important figures in the following decades, met the challenge admirably, delivering the studio's best-looking film since Sleeping Beauty. The songs of this film are, for the most part, pretty light and short, some more memorable than others, but the score by Buddy Baker is something else. There are recurring themes woven throughout that will get stuck in my head on their own, and Baker runs the gamut between cheery and quaint to wistful and bittersweet to tense and anxiety-inducing. This is one of the best musical scores in the entire canon, which when you've got to measure up against giants like George Bruns and Alan Menken is certainly saying something. This is also the last film where the music would be edited by Evelyn Kennedy. She was the music editor for over 100 films, including every canon entry from The Lady and the Tramp to The Fox and the Hound, as well as Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks. She was often the only credited woman on those films who wasn't an actor, which for a male-dominated business like movies in the mid-20th century is a testament to just how good she was at her job, matching everything the composers wrote to everything the voice actors said and every other sound effect, synchronizing it all to the animation. Apparently she had a little sign on the door of the room she worked in that said, "Nobody can enter except Richard Sherman," showing the then young songwriter the ropes of what she was doing. The film opens in silence, panning through the forest much like Bambi did as the credits roll, though unfortunately the film makes almost no use of the by then quite old multi-plane camera. However, the zoom through this spider web is just immaculate. The score begins with just a few drums before slowly escalating into the full orchestra, and Buddy Baker is in full swing as the mother fox desperately running with her pup is revealed in a scene straight out of Mannix's book. The fox hides her child at the base of a fence post, flees to draw the hunters away, and it's brutal, and a very effective opening to the story, setting the stakes for what will happen later. The baby fox is swiftly discovered by Pearl Bailey's big mama.
You poor little fella. It's all right. Big Mama's here.
Who, with the help of Dinky and Boomer, gets the nearby widow Tweet to foster him.
That's what I'm going to call you. Todd.
Baby Todd is adorable, and we also see the progress made with xerography. The fox's outlines are done in red, which is easier on the eyes than the harsh black lines of the Scratchies. Similarly, Copper's outlines are done in brown, and we get to compare how he's treated by the hunter, Amos Slade.
Well, how's this for hunting dogs?
Slade's cabin and the barrels he ties the dogs to are directly from the book, and there are details throughout that show the animators really did their research. After a cute scene of Todd causing a ruckus in the barn, one of the few fully animated by Don Bluth, we get to see the B-plot of Dinky and Boomer trying to catch Squeaks the caterpillar. This mostly serves as comic relief.
Button your beak, will you?
But it's also kind of an echo to Amos Slade and his hunting. It shows that the animals, too, are hunters in turn. It's interesting how the only time Todd is shown hunting, it's for a fish, and for the most part, it's the birds who take up the theme of the predator-prey relationship from the novel. The birds are also very entertaining. I love how Dinky realistically bounces around like the little bird he is, and I just adore Squeak's scream. But it's when Dinky and Boomer shrug off Todd's pleas to play that we get into the meat of the story, as the fox happens upon the hound. The two instantly take a shine to each other, and the child voice actors do very well, particularly a young Corey Feldman as Copper in one of his first film roles. The pair play hide and seek.
No, Copper, you can't peek. Oh.
With Todd using tricks taken right out of Mannix's novel to hide from Copper. This leads a pleasantly surprised Big Mama to comment in song form.
When you're the best of friends.
This scene does a lot of legwork, with the voice acting, the animated performances, and Pearl Bailey's song very effectively selling a best friendship that really is only playing out over a couple days.
They can't understand the magic of your wonderland.
The entire rest of the film hinges on this scene, and it creates a remarkably solid foundation. Now here's the big question. Are the fox and the hound gay? On the one hand, yes, absolutely yes. They are very, very gay for each other. Just look at the way they look at each other. This movie may as well be a pride flag. On the other hand, does it matter? Because the more important question is, do Todd and Copper love each other?
You're my very best friend.
To me, it makes no difference whether what we're watching is eros or philia. These two canids very clearly love each other, and that's what makes this a Romeo and Juliet story. Todd and Copper desperately want to be together. Whether that's to make sweet lust in the tall grass or just to hang out platonically, it doesn't matter. They yearn for each other, and yes, those faces they make as adults when they meet a year later can only be described as yearning, but the circumstances that society forces upon them keeps them tragically apart.
You're breaking all the rules.
And eventually pits them against one another. But for the moment, Todd and Copper are fully in the honeymoon phase of their relationship.
Give me a head start and I can beat ya.
But Amos Slade doesn't want a dog that plays hooky all day. He wants a hound he can train to hunt. So the hunter steps in and ties Copper to his barrel. This could very easily be read as a parent not wanting their child to play with the kid next door, who's a little too obviously fruity.
Hello, Travis.
Or even the wrong skin color in their view. Or, since Slade doesn't yet know about Todd, simply the strict parent who wants to control what their child does at all times. But also, side note, can we all acknowledge this is animal abuse? I mean, training an animal to help you kill other animals is its own can of worms, but here I specifically mean leaving the dog outside tied to a barrel. Slade may not beat his dogs or starve them, but he severely restricts their freedom and almost entirely ignores them until he needs them to do something. When I was a kid, there was a family across the street that owned a husky, a big, beautiful dog, and every day I'd walk by that house and that dog would be tied up outside next to the garage. And when I'd bring this up to adults, they'd explain, oh, huskies overheat if they're kept inside, and sure, but they still chose to get a husky in an area with warm summers. Why would you get a pet that you just ignore all day? You're in the house doing whatever, and the dog is just outside, chained to a wall, bored out of its gourd, and I'm pretty sure the parents told their kids not to play with the dog because they'd come outside and play on the front lawn and just ignore the dog tied up a few feet away. That's no life for an animal, and regardless of what else happens, Copper and Chief at least deserved better treatment than a barrel. But with the pup tied up, Todd decides to visit him, which quickly goes south as Chief wakes up and gives chase. And honestly, I would be terrified of any dog that wanted to get me so badly it was literally dragging a barrel behind it. Slade hears the ruckus halfway through and concludes that Todd is after his chickens and gets out his gun. This is not the first Disney film to show a firearm being used, but I think we can safely say that, apart from the Martins and the Coys, The Fox and the Hound has the most gun firings of any of these movies we've watched so far. Todd is running for his life and takes shelter in Widow Tweed's car as she brings milk to market, which is no deterrent to Slade, prompting Tweed to give him a piece of her mind.
No, it ain't loaded.
The two have an argument over the keeping of a fox as a pet, and while Tweed manages to protect Todd for now, Slade promises to shoot him on sight if he's ever on his property again.
And next time I won't miss.
It is on that bitter note that Slade leaves for the winter, taking Copper with him, leaving the two new friends unable even to say goodbye to each other, apart from the Hound's mournful howls. It's at this juncture that Big Mama decides to finally explain to Todd the reality of him being a fox and Copper being a hound.
Copper's gonna come back a trained hunting dog. A real killer.
This can very easily be read as human kids being discouraged from being friends as they grow older, either for being a different race, as would have been relatively common in the 70s and 80s, or for being a different gender. How many parents have told their daughter not to hang out with a male friend because he would grow up to be a real killer?
They play? What do they play?
We like to think we've gotten past such prejudices, but if you look at how people socialize, the reality is that most people end up segregating themselves all on their own. White people tend to be friends with other white people, and black folk tend to stick with other black folk, as do Latinos and Asians and indigenous people. And by and large, men are friends with other men, and women socialize with other women. Now sure, there's something to be said about finding friends with shared experiences, particularly for minority groups finding safe spaces where they can be themselves, but the reality reality is that a lot of this voluntary segregation is from societal expectations. Parents telling children who they're allowed to be friends with. Movies and shows and commercials depicting homogenous friend groups, enforcing stereotypes. Diverse friend groups tend to happen only when people make deliberate choices to meet people outside of their in-group. Queer friend groups tend to have more racial and gender diversity, but they're still self-segregating with other queer people. But if you just take a bunch of 4 or 5-year-olds of a mix of races and genders and put them all in a kindergarten class together, they will happily make friends with anyone around them. Todd and Copper become friends because they were at a young enough age that they hadn't learned yet that they weren't supposed to be friends. And so Todd is confident that when he sees Copper again, they'll be as good of friends as they were before.
Forever is a long, long time, and time has a way of changing things.
We then get to see Copper growing up and learning to hunt. Apart from the occasional howl or gunshot, the only sound in this sequence is Buddy Baker's score, and honestly this part gets stuck in my head every so often. We get to see the rising jealousy between the two dogs as by the time spring comes, Chief has been supplanted as Slade's favorite. As the hounds return, we get to see how Todd has grown up as well, including a fancy new collar, which feels like a reference to Lady and the Tramp. After some risible shenanigans between the birds and the caterpillar,
Holy smoke!
Todd finally gets to see his friend once more.
Boy, has he grown big.
Movie, you are not beating the Yowie allegations. But even as Todd makes plans to visit his old friend, Chief is whispering poison into Copper's ear.
You gotta think nasty.
This is easily Pat Buttram's best role in the canon. He fills Chief with venom and vitriol, making his on-site hatred of Todd very believable. Speaking of, here comes our fox in the role of Romeo visiting his Juliet. This is staged basically like the balcony scene. He might as well be saying, "Soft, what light through yonder barrel breaks? 'Tis the east and Copper is the sun." But Copper, to Todd's despair, has changed, just as Big Mama said he would. He's been conditioned by Slade and Chief, indoctrinated to be a hunter, a natural enemy of the fox he once called friend. Todd is devastated, but before he can truly react, Chief wakes up and the chase begins anew. Slade takes his hounds after the fox, racing up the hill and into the train yard. Todd hides beneath some lumber, which fools Chief, but Copper, now the superior tracker, finds his childhood friend. And as a final testament to that now severed friendship, lets him go. Todd flees, but then, on the train tracks, Chief catches up to him. They race onto the bridge, realizing too late what is coming for them. Todd flattens himself, but Chief has no time to react, and is killed. I'm sorry, no, he doesn't die. Time the fuck out. This is the biggest and most consequential deviation the movie makes from Mannix's novel. In Disney's film, Chief just walks it off. A train to the goddamn face. And he just walks it off. In the words of Ron Clements, a directing animator on this film, Chief has to die. The picture doesn't work if he just breaks his leg. Copper doesn't have motivation to hate the fox. In the book, the hunter's entire vendetta is caused by Chief getting killed by the train, which he blames on Todd. All of those hunts, the relentless pursuit of the wild animal, is because he blames the fox for the death of his precious hound. Clements is correct. The rest of the film doesn't make sense if Chief survives, but Art Stevens wouldn't budge. His reply was, "Geez, we never killed a main character in a Disney film and we're not starting now." I'm sorry, excuse me, did you not see Bambi, Art? Who am I kidding? He absolutely had seen Bambi. He was employed by the studio at the time and likely worked on that film himself. And he also probably remembered the very public backlash to Bambi's mom dying, and that is most likely why he didn't want Chief to die. He didn't want a repeat of that. So he made what he felt was a safe decision. It's a good thing the rest of this movie is so good, and honestly, if you just pretend that Chief dies for real here, it gives the film so much more emotional weight. I would pay money for Disney to go back and edit this movie just to have Chief die. But alas, they've had over 40 years to make such a change, and they likely never will. So Copper swears vengeance because his fellow hound fell down and broke his hip.
If it's the last thing I do, I'll get you for this.
Cool story, bro. Meanwhile, Todd has managed to reach the safety of Widow Tweed's farmhouse, but soon enough, Amos Slade is banging on the door, demanding the fox's hide. Tweed stands her ground until he leaves, but she knows this cannot continue. Todd is no longer safe here, so she gathers him up, puts him in her car, and starts to drive. We met, it seems, such a short time ago. You looked at me, needing me so. Yet from your sadness our happiness grew, and I found out I needed you too. I remember how we used to play. I recall those rainy days, the fire's glow that kept us warm, and now I find we're both alone. Goodbye may seem forever, farewell is like the end, but in my heart's memory, there you'll always be. No matter how many times I watch this film, that song always makes me cry. It's the centerpiece of a vivid and sincere exploration of different kinds of love. The fiery infatuation between Todd and Copper, the bond between Todd and Widow Tweed.
Bless my soul, it's a baby fox.
The more distant paternalistic love Amos Slade feels for his dogs and the reverence they feel for him in return. The strained rivalry between Copper and Chief. Later, the more stable attachment between Todd and Vixie, as we shall soon see that Todd is in fact a bi-king. Basically, every form of love the Greeks talked about is demonstrated. Hell, the porcupine shows hospitality to Todd on his first night in the game preserve, contrasted with the crotchety badger's distrust of newcomers.
Why don't you go back where you came from?
Where have I heard that before? I'm sure that xenophobia is no longer a relevant topic that needs to be discussed. We are shown example after example of healthy and unhealthy forms of love. Big Mama and Widow Tweed's compassion driving them to help a baby that is not their own versus Amos Slade's obsession with hunting down Todd. There's the immediate fondness between Todd and Copper that is strained to the breaking point by society demanding them to conform. We see two manifestations of storge with Slade and Tweed's treatments of their respective pets, the rivalry between Chief and Copper versus the partnership of Dinky and Boomer. And of course, perhaps the only truly healthy relationship in this entire movie, Todd and Vixie entering into a romantic relationship based on a solid foundation that is supported by the surrounding community. But of course, even here we have the snag that they are a matched pair, like for like. They are socially acceptable because they have self-segregated. Todd and Copper are just too different to be together, but Todd and Vixie are society's OTP. As we see Widow Tweed return home, I just have to comment on how gorgeous the animation in this movie is. Like, just look at the storm clouds, the wind rippling over the grass, sublime. This film is easily a cut above The Rescuers. However, we are quickly reminded of Art Stevens' regrettable decision as we find Chief laid out with a single cast on his back leg.
Get back in there before I break your other leg.
Sure, just casually insult the victim of the crime you have embarked on a vendetta to avenge, because that makes sense. Except it kinda does make sense, because that's the kind of person Amos Slade is. It's not even about Chief anymore. Slade is consumed by his need to kill Todd. The reason why doesn't even matter anymore. As far as he's concerned, Chief is a burden to be tolerated until he's healed and able to track again. So his focus is on how he's going to catch that fox, which he demonstrates to Copper. Jesus Christ, that is terrifying. Meanwhile, we get to watch Todd's awkward attempts at wooing Vixie.
Oh, raspberries.
And then the worst song in the film, Appreciate the Lady, which makes little sense and feels a little misogynistic. Of course, once the two foxes reconcile, Boomer has to be physically dragged away.
But Big Mama, it's just getting interesting.
Control yourself, Paul Winchell. After that bit of a breather, Slade's hunt begins in earnest, illegally cutting his way into the game preserve with Copper in tow. The music that plays as he lays out the traps for Todd is eerily similar to what played at the very beginning when Todd's mom was being hunted, likely also by Slade. Like, Jesus, how the hell do you make a harmonica sound threatening? Buddy Baker, you should have done more movies. His filmography is almost entirely forgotten old Disney live-action movies, a gig he got by being friends with George Bruns. The man should have been given an action flick or a horror movie, which is what The Fox and the Hound effectively becomes as Todd tries to navigate the gully that Slade trapped. He manages to escape the bear traps, but he and Vixie are then driven into their den, and Slade covers one end with a brush fire and waits at the other with his shotgun. It's viscerally claustrophobic until finally the foxes burst through the flames to escape. But when they head for higher ground, there's a bear waiting for them. This monster of an animal was animated by Glenn Keane, and it is just perfection. The rippling fur and fat and muscle, this grizzly has presence and fury, and Amos Slade is caught in one of his own traps trying to get out of the way. And it gets me every time when Todd hears Copper in trouble after all he's been put through, chased, attacked, smoked out, and burned, and still, with only the slightest of hesitations, he turns around to help his friend. Because their fondness for each other, their connection is that deep. The fight with the bear is easily one of the best in the entire canon. The enormity of the bear compared to the slightness yet speed of Todd. A lot of animated fights lack weight or tension, but it's very clear here that all Todd can do is get the bear's attention. This is not a fight he can win, but only run from. And when he tries to flee across a log spanning a waterfall, the bear follows, but the wood cannot take its weight, and both animals fall. We are left for a few moments in suspense before Todd reemerges at the shore, exhausted, in pain, and on the verge of death. And of course, this is when Slade reappears, his shotgun cocked and ready to fire point blank. And Copper steps in the way. This is love. Sacrifice is love. Standing up against hatred is love. What greater proof is there that you love someone than that you want to protect them? And it's here, at last, at the end, that Slade realizes what he's been doing.
Well, come on, boy. Let's go home.
Because you can always stop being an asshole. You can always stop seeking revenge or trying to hurt someone you feel wronged you. You can always let go of that hatred. Recognizing that the target of your rage is simply another living creature just trying to exist. Because that's what love truly is. It's empathy. All the way down. As we fade back to the farm, we get the payoff of that B-plot as Squeaks has transformed into a beautiful butterfly.
Good luck, honey.
Love transforms you. In Squeaks' case, it was self-love, taking care of himself with those two birds chasing after him. But Todd and Copper's love for each other changed them, too. And Amos fucking Slade, God bless him, finally changed, too, letting Widow Tweed change the bandages from when he stepped in his own fucking bear trap.
Oh, land sakes. I don't know if I like that.
That's why I don't think of Slade as a villain. He's an antagonist, certainly, and absolutely an asshole, but really he's a character, and a cast of characters that clash with each other yet also grow and change for the better. And even though Todd at the end is with Vixie instead of Copper, we know where his heart still lies.
We will always be friends forever.
Disney's The Fox and the Hound, though delayed by Don Bluth's departure and the other disagreements in the studio, was once again the most profitable film the animation department had yet produced. Which is kind of wild to think about because it's kind of a forgotten movie now. Disney very rarely uses it in advertising or merchandise nowadays. It has no characters in the parks that I'm aware of, and perhaps most egregiously, as of recording, it has no representation in Lorcana. Give my boy Squeaks a card. I want a Floodborn of him as a butterfly. That's probably because it came right before Disney's biggest disappointment, which we'll be discussing next time, though arguably the new generation of animators got so passionate about The Black Cauldron because The Fox and the Hound was so successful in its original run. For me, The Fox and the Hound is one of my favorites in the canon. It is sumptuously animated. Honestly, there are parts of it that would have been right at home in the restoration. It's that good. And I didn't even talk about Mickey Rooney or Kurt Russell voicing the adult Todd and Copper. Apart from the nitpick of Chief's survival, this is almost a perfect movie with resonant themes and a story that never fails to make me cry. I highly recommend it if you haven't experienced it yet. And I'm very glad to have read the book, which honestly should be taught in high schools. It's that good. And it's a shame that it's been so hard to get a hold of, as it's been out of print since 1971. Getting a first edition copy will run you hundreds of dollars on eBay. Thankfully, it will be getting a new printing in just over a month as of this video's publication, and I highly encourage you to get a copy of the book book as well. But the film version teaches us that love comes in many forms, often unexpected. We should all endeavor to be more compassionate like Big Mama, more warm and giving like Widow Tweed, and to try to be more like Copper and Todd, hopelessly in love with each other, platonically or otherwise.
A fox and a hound playing together.
Don't let society or parents or anything else stand in the way of friendship or romance. Let love win. As ever, I am deeply grateful to my Patreon patrons, including but not limited to Gurgi85, Avery and their ADHDs, Jinx KB, Savannah Mighty Zebra, Tony Houst, Bewilder Eye, Jekko, CBL, Daniel Özbjörnsson, Sugar Cubed Glider, Lord Christine, Andrew T, Agent Shifter, Husky Trent, Lemon Lamb Laura, and Bard in the Labyrinth. This content is sponsored by viewers like you. It's only $5 a month, or $10 if you want me to say your name at the end here. I've also announced some patron stretch goals at which I will make some fun music videos. Either way, join me next time as we explore what war might be good for with The Black Cauldron.